And I'm live. We got another view. And let's see if we can do this TMI live right now. It's about to rain out here, so I don't know how long it's going to last, so we'll see.
All right, welcome in everyone to the deep dive. We've got a really interesting topic today, something I think a lot of us see happening all around Dayton, all these new homes popping up, especially in areas that, not that long ago were just farmland.
Yeah, it seems like there's construction everywhere these days.
Absolutely. And it got me thinking, how do all those new houses actually get connected to the power grid? How does flipping a switch on the wall actually turn on a light in a brand new house?
It's a great question. When you really start to look into it, it's actually a lot more complicated than just running some wires from point A to point B. There's a ton of planning involved, approvals, regulations, and of course the actual physical construction of the infrastructure to get that electricity flowing.
So for today's deep dive, we're going to try to break down that whole process for you, from those initial ideas all the way to that moment when someone gets to flip the switch in their new home for the first time.
And we've gone through a ton of source material to get the full picture, so we'll walk you through everything from zoning changes and environmental reviews to working with the power company and understanding all those electrical codes.
Yeah, we really want to give you a solid grasp of what it takes to power a new neighborhood without getting too bogged down in technical jargon. We're going for those aha moments where you're like, oh, that's how it works.
Exactly.
So let's start right at the beginning. You've got this plot of farmland and you want to build houses on it. What's the first hurdle?
Well, the very first step is you got to change how that land is classified. You can't just start building houses on land that's zoned for agriculture. You need to get it rezoned for residential use.
So basically going from cows and corn to cul-de-sacs and kitchens, right?
Pretty much. And even within residential zoning, there are different categories. In Dayton, for example, you've got things like ER4, SR2, MR5. These designations determine what kind of homes can be built, how many units per acre, things like that.
So is this rezoning process usually pretty straightforward, or can it get a little messy sometimes?
It can definitely get complicated and sometimes even political. We found an example in Clayton, which isn't too far from Dayton, where a proposed housing development on former farmland actually went to a referendum, a public vote.
Wow, so the whole community got to weigh in on whether that land should be rezoned.
Exactly. Shows you how much people care about what happens in their neighborhoods. And, it's interesting because Ohio law does have some provisions about agricultural exemptions from certain zoning rules.
So are those exemptions designed to protect farmland from being turned into housing developments?
Well, they're more geared towards protecting existing farms in more rural areas, not so much within city limits like Dayton. But it's something to keep in mind, especially when you're talking about large-scale land conversion. And it's important to think about the economic impact too, not just for the developers, but for the people who own that farmland. One of our sources mentioned a case in Monroe, Ohio, where a zoning change was argued to have a pretty significant economic impact on the landowners.
So there's a lot of different perspectives to consider: legal, economic, and the community's point of view.
Definitely. And the rules aren't static either. Cities are constantly updating their zoning codes to reflect changing needs and priorities. Dayton, for example, has been working on updates to their zoning code, looking at things like urban agriculture, accessory dwelling units, mixed-use developments, and things like that.
So it's a pretty dynamic process, this whole zoning thing.
It is. And for anyone who wants to really dive into the details, the city of Dayton actually makes its entire zoning code and map available online. So you can see exactly what's allowed in your neighborhood and how things might be changing.
That's super handy. So we've got this farmland that's been rezoned for residential use. What's the next step in the process?
Well, for larger developments, especially the kind you see on former farmland, Dayton uses something called Planned Development Districts, or PDDs. It's like creating a custom zoning plan just for that specific development.
So it gives developers a bit more flexibility in designing the community.
Exactly. But it also comes with certain conditions. Like in Dayton, residential PDDs often have minimum size requirements, maybe 10 acres or 50 dwelling units, and frequently require a homeowners association to manage things.
Makes sense. You've got this big development. You need some structure to keep things running smoothly. So once the zoning's sorted out, developers have to submit detailed plans to the city, right?
Yep, that's where the planning division and the city plan board come in. And those plans go way beyond just where the houses will be. They have to include all the infrastructure. including a detailed plan for how the electricity will get to those houses.
So it's not just saying, yeah, we'll run some wires. It's got to be a comprehensive plan, right?
Absolutely. The city needs to see where the new development will connect to the existing power grid, what the projected electrical demand will be, how the electricity will be distributed within the development, and if any new substations or transformers are needed.
And I imagine those plans have to be pretty darn thorough to get approved.
Oh, yeah. And for those who are curious about what the city looks for, a lot of those development plans become public record. You might find some on the city's online portal. And for certain housing types, organizations like Greater Dayton Premier Management might have information as well. Even property records at the Montgomery County Recorder's Office can be helpful for understanding past development in an area.
It's like a treasure trove of information for those who love to dig into these things.
It is.
All right, so we've got the zoning sorted out, the development plans are approved, it seems like we're ready to start building, but there's one big thing we haven't talked about yet. What about the environmental impact of turning farmland into a neighborhood?
That is a critical part of the process, and it's where environmental impact assessments, or EIAs, come in. In Ohio, depending on the scale of the project, and especially when you're talking about converting farmland, you're probably going to need to conduct an EIA.
So what exactly does an EIA involve?
Well, often it starts with something called a Phase I Environmental Site Assessment, or ESA. This is all about figuring out if there's any potential for contamination on the property.
So like if there were any hazardous materials used on the land in the past, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They'll look into the history of the land, past uses, any records of spills or violations, even things like old maps and aerial photographs. And they'll do a physical inspection too, looking for things like storage tanks or any unusual conditions. They might even interview previous owners or local officials.
Wow, that sounds incredibly thorough. What happens if they find something concerning during that initial assessment?
Well, that might trigger a Phase 2 ESA, which involves actually taking physical samples of the soil, water, maybe even waste materials, and having them analyzed in a lab to see what's there.
And I'm guessing if they do find contamination, it's the developer's responsibility to clean it up.
That's a key point. Under Ohio and federal law, property owners can be held liable for cleanup, even if they didn't cause the contamination. So these ESAs are super important for developers to protect themselves and ensure the land is safe for future residents.
It's not just about building houses, it's about being responsible stewards of the land. Are there any other environmental agencies involved besides the Ohio EPA?
Yeah, definitely. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources, ODNR, also plays a big role. They're focused on the impact on natural resources, like endangered species and their habitats. So developers might need to go through an environmental review with ODNR, providing all sorts of details about the project and how it might affect the local ecosystems.
And it's probably best to get ODNR involved early on, right? Avoid any potential roadblocks down the line.
Exactly. And then there's also the Ohio Housing Finance Agency, or OHFA. If a developer is seeking funding from them, OHFA has its own set of environmental standards that need to be met. And don't forget, the Ohio EPA has different divisions for air, water, and waste management too. So depending on the specifics of the development, permits might be needed in those areas as well, like, say, for managing stormwater runoff during construction.
So it's a pretty multifaceted process on the environmental front, lots of different agencies and regulations to navigate.
It is, but it's all ultimately about ensuring that new development happens in a way that's sustainable and protects the environment.
Okay, so we've cleared the zoning hurdles, we've got our plans approved, we've addressed all the environmental concerns. It seems like we're finally ready to talk about getting the actual electricity to these future homes. And in Dayton, that means working with AES Ohio.
Exactly. AES Ohio, formerly known as Dayton Power and Light, is the primary electric utility in the Dayton area. They have a long history in the region, and building a good relationship with them early on is absolutely essential for developers.
So what's the first step in working with AES Ohio?
One of the first things developers typically do is contact AES Ohio's Construction Control Center to get something called an Electrical Service Information Form, or ESIF. This form basically kicks off the formal process of coordinating the new development's electrical service.
So the developer fills out the ESIF, and then AES Ohio sends out a crew to start stringing wires.
Well, it's a little more involved than that. AES Ohio will work closely with the developer to figure out the best way to connect the new development to the grid. They'll also take care of setting up temporary electrical service during the construction phase, so the builders can power their tools and equipment.
Makes sense. You can't exactly build houses in the dark.
Definitely not. And before AES Ohio will actually turn on the power to any of the new homes, they require a thorough inspection of all the electrical work to make sure it meets all the safety codes.
I imagine that's pretty important. We'll get into those codes in a bit, but before we do, I wanted to ask about something I came across in our research. AES Ohio is involved in some kind of market-based auction for electricity generation, right? How does that fit into the whole picture?
Yeah, that's basically how AES Ohio obtains the electricity they distribute to their customers. It's a market mechanism that ultimately affects the price everyone pays for power. And on a separate note, AES Ohio has also been investing a lot in smart grid technology across the Miami Valley. This is basically a modernization of the electrical grid, which can lead to a more reliable and efficient power system.
So those new developments could actually benefit from that investment in smart grid technology.
They could. And then there's the whole matter of digging, which is obviously a big part of installing new power lines. I'm sure there's some pretty strict rules around that.
Oh, absolutely. I've heard of that 811 number.
Exactly. Before any digging starts, whether it's for the power lines themselves or anything else, anyone doing excavation work has to call 811, which is the Ohio Utility Protection Service. This notifies all the utility companies in the area to come out and mark the locations of their underground lines.
So it's not just about electricity, it's gas, water, telecommunications, everything.
Right. It's a critical safety measure to prevent accidental damage, which can be dangerous and incredibly expensive to fix. And for developers who need to coordinate anything with AES Ohio throughout this process, their construction control center is the main point of contact.
Okay, so we've got the power company on board, we know where to dig. Now we're actually ready to start building the physical infrastructure to get that electricity to the houses. And one of the big choices developers have to make is whether to go with overhead power lines or bury them underground. What are the main pros and cons of each approach?
That's a huge decision with both immediate and long-term consequences. Let's start with overhead lines. The biggest advantage is cost. They're simply cheaper and easier to install. And if there's ever a problem, like a fault in the line, it's usually pretty easy to find and fix.
But they're not exactly the prettiest things to look at, and they're pretty vulnerable to the weather, right? Trees falling on them, ice storms, that sort of thing.
Yeah, they're definitely more susceptible to damage from weather, trees, even accidents. And that can lead to more power outages, which nobody wants.
Yeah.
And then there's the ongoing maintenance. The utility company has to regularly trim trees around those lines to prevent them from causing problems.
Okay, what about underground lines? I know they're more expensive, but they seem to be getting more popular, especially in newer developments.
Yeah, for good reason. First off, they're just more aesthetically pleasing. You don't have those poles and wires cluttering up the landscape. And some studies suggest that underground lines can actually increase property values. But the real benefit is reliability. Because they're buried, they're much better protected from weather, trees, accidents. So fewer power outages, which is a big selling point for homeowners. And in the long run, maintenance costs can actually be lower because you don't have to worry about storm damage or tree trimming.
Sounds like there are a lot of advantages to underground lines, so why doesn't everyone just go with them?
Well, that higher upfront cost is the biggest deterrent. For transmission lines, burying them can be 4 to 14 times more expensive than overhead lines. And if something does go wrong, repairs can be way more complicated and costly. You have to dig up the line, which can disrupt service and potentially damage property.
And I imagine getting those repairs done takes a lot longer too.
It can.